Welcome to another episode of Forsaken by Shadows, a production of stories by Sarah Danielle. Don't forget, we now have a Discord server, and I'd love to have you join our conversation there. The link will be in the show notes, and everyone is welcome. Last time, on Forsaken by Shadows, from Risman's point of view. Everything was going just right, until it wasn't. I got to the cove early and was able to catch up on some much-needed rest, until Beltel awoke me with his usual bombastic curiosity. I had arrived early by choice. He'd come to escape his brother. But I can only give him so much credit. He's upset about a blessing, a promotion in rank that's well-deserved and long overdue. But his misfortune is my gain, as I am being raised to take his place under Belnir's command. I am beyond delighted, but also full of uncertainty. It all seems to be too good to be true. Because it is. When I go to retrieve my practice weapon, I find strangers at the weapons rack. 3 surface dwellers and Arden Zeren, the son of Torafane, come back from the fleet. They seem pleasant enough, except for an elf of golden hues. Valen is his name, and his manners leave much to be desired. He takes my sword, but I let it go, having more important things to concern myself with. But when I return to my own team, something isn't right. Torafane argues with Anders, the commander of the militia, and somehow that argument involves Belnir, my soon-to-be captain. Sealed orders are exchanged, and by the time Belnir reaches us, I can already guess what they say. I'm not going to be commissioned after all. Instead, my place is being given to Arden, and no one knows why. Belnir asked me to help Anders test the new voices who seek to join our community. It's a pitiful attempt to distract me from the devastating news, but what else can I do? I'm a soldier, and I know how to obey. Forsaken by Shadows, Part 3. Where Shadows Linger. Chapter 4. The Testing. Risman. Risman ascended the stairs that led to the top of the bluffs, trying not to let the ringing blades and shouts of training churn his jealousy into nausea. He moved his feet out of habit, forcing each step toward the depression known as the pit with mounting disdain. This really wasn't fair. He probably should have just gone home. Testing new voices? He wasn't even qualified for the militia. What made him qualified to test against new voices? Sour and frustrated, he kicked a pebble that just happened to be in the way of his toe. It skittered across the uneven terrain and did little to relieve his vexation. What a joke. Anders probably didn't really want Risman's help. It was probably all Belnir's idea, treating him like a child, offering him a toy sword when he'd been asking for steel, keeping him out of the way while he trained his new team. But even as he thought it, the notion shamed him. If he really believed it, then that meant he believed Belnir was capable of lying to him. Once, he had believed all drow lied just as often as they breathed. But that was before he had made friends, before he met people who would tell him the truth, even when he didn't want to hear it. It was part of the unspoken agreement that formed between friends. Resigned, Risman approached the pit, which was as aptly named as the cove. A sheer, 20-foot drop into an almost perfectly round arena. What had caused the rocks to form this way, Risman would never know, but it made for an ideal battleground when fights needed to remain in close proximity. Risman hesitated at the top, remembering his own testing 11 months prior. There was Anders, of course, and Gillette, the half-elf instructor in charge of the beginners class. Beside her was Rothgar, a drow, one of the instructors of the intermediate class, and Elvir, another drow, who taught in Risman's former advanced school. It wasn't the same mix present when he had tested, but they represented the same thing. Teachers and trainers, ready to assess the skills of these new would-be soldiers. The 3 surface dwellers stood in the center of the pit, side by side, listening as Anders barked out the introductions and explained the expectations of the test. He considered turning back, returning to Belnir and telling him he'd changed his mind, but he wouldn't dare. The shame would be impossible to recover from. Besides, Elvir had just seen him and tipped his chin in friendly acknowledgement, which alerted Anders to his presence, and the dwarf broke off mid-sentence to hail him. "Aye, it's about time you showed up. Hurry up and get down here before me beard loses its coppery sheen. The light's leaking away and we've got stuff to do." The coarse voice jarred Risman into action, erasing all thoughts of changing his mind. Anders was rough around the edges and quick with the tongue lashing, but Risman liked him once he got used to him. On the other side of the pit were steep, narrow stairs carved into the rock, but Risman didn't waste time going for them. Instead, he stepped right off the ledge, letting his levitation magic catch his fall. The moment his feet hit the sand, he hurried across to the instructors. "Now, as I was saying," Anders said, as Risman took his place beside Gillette, though a little off to the side, lest he be mistaken for an instructor. "We're gonna test your skill with the blade through one-on-one duels first. This lad here's going to be your opponent." The eyes of the new voices trailed over him when Anders gestured, and Risman tried not to read too much into the expressions. A little too much hunger for violence from the woman, a little too little interest from the human. As for the golden elf, he almost looked disgusted. Was he still upset over the sword incident? "Before we get started," Anders continued, "I want to hear your tales. What's your battle experience, your weapon of choice, and the reason for fighting? Mind ya, I don't want your whole life story, just what's relevant. Ladies first." The woman cocked her head to the side, considering. "My name is Jezra Heartwood," she began. "My brother, Korath, and I grew up on the plains south of the Sword Mountains. We've been defending our village from raiders since we were big enough to fight, before joining up with your fleet. I prefer the bow, though I've been told I won't be finding one here." "You were told right," Anders said. "Bows are forbidden by the Dark Maiden. Ask a priestess if you want the details as to why." "I can get by with a sword," she said, unconcerned. "And most martial weapons. Our dad taught us not to be picky." It was only when Jezzer glanced at the big man next to her that Risman realized he was Korath, her brother. He tried not to let his surprise show. They looked nothing alike, but he quelled any rising curiosity to know more as Jezra went on. "As for why I fight," she shrugged. "I was raised to defend the defenseless. When we met your fleet and learned of the need here, it seemed like the place to go." "Very good," Anders said, turning his eyes to the human. "And you?" "It's like Jezra said," the man rumbled. He didn't quite make eye contact with anyone. "We protected our village, but we wanted to do more. I fight with whatever I can grasp." He held up his abnormally large hands, then fell silent, glancing expectantly at Valen, who had yet to shift his piercing glare from Risman. The golden elf was silent for so long that Risman wondered if he was going to refuse to answer. But just as Anders started to lose his patience, the elf snapped his attention to the dwarf and smiled a congenial smile. "I'm Valen Rivertone," he said, with a flourishing bow. "I've been trained in a monastery and—" His eyes roved over the others, lingering not only on Risman but on Hrothgar and Elvir as well. His smile curled. "That's all I want to share." "Oh, so that's how it was." Risman didn't try to hide his surprise, arching an eyebrow and glancing at Gillette, but the usually critical instructor showed no reaction, as if this was a perfectly acceptable way to disobey Anders' orders. Elvir and Hrothgar, however, looked unimpressed. Perhaps they, too, had noted how Valen's gaze had lingered on them. But the dwarf merely huffed, not pressing for more. "Right then, let's get started.
Jezra!
Pardon, sir, Valen said, interrupting the commander. Anders just stared at him, and Risman suspected he was so unused to being interrupted that he didn't know how to respond. He braced for an explosion of dwarven temper, but Valen took the opportunity to speak. What about our opponent? He gestured offhandedly to Risman without even looking his way. Everyone else has been introduced, their credentials laid bare, but him. That hardly seems fair. The dwarf's face turned red and splotchy, but he managed to control his outburst. Valen was a guest, after all.
Him? He doesn't matter. He's just the elf you're fighting against.
Normally, the words wouldn't have stung. Anders didn't enjoy being corrected, and Risman was used to his ways. It wasn't that he didn't matter. It was merely that Anders didn't want to look like he'd forgotten about Risman, even if he truly had never meant to introduce him in the first place, which Risman would have preferred. But he was still nursing the very raw rejection of his childhood dreams, still quietly wondering why he'd been found unworthy of being commissioned. He did matter, and what was left of his pride demanded he make it known, especially to Valen.
You already know my name,
Risman said, cutting off Anders yet again as he stepped forward, meeting the elf's golden stare with his own crimson ire.
But I'll repeat it for you in case you weren't paying attention the first time we met. I am Risman Tyr, formerly of the 5th House of Mendel Berensen, before my dissension. In addition to the years of experience gained from my home instruction, I've trained 5 years at Melee Magther and 1 year here, under the fine instruction of those who stand before you now.
Well, at least under Elvir, he'd never set foot in Gillette or Rothgar's classes, but he had a point to make.
I favor the Dreyavelv combat style.
In a flash, Risman had both his practice sword and his real, sharpened dagger in his hand, flourishing them in a simultaneous twirl that had taken him twice as long to master as his naturally ambidextrous classmates.
But for this demonstration, I'll be using Saraleg.
He tossed his dagger point into the sand where it stuck. Much as he might not like his opponents, he wasn't about to take a real blade into battle and risk drawing actual blood. He was civilized now.
Is there anything else you'd like to know?
At the beginning of his speech, Valen looked surprised, then offended, perhaps at Risman's insinuation he hadn't been paying attention previously. By the end of it, he was sneering. "I've heard of your city and school," he remarked, his light tone not matching his expression. "I'm surprised it's something you'd boast about." Now that stung more than Anders' offhanded blustering, and the rage made Risman's blood hot. His nostrils flared, but before he could finish drawing in his breath, the commander regained control.
"That's enough, lads. Save it for the testing."
His voice was gruff, but when Risman glanced at him, the dwarf shot him a wink. Evidently, he approved of Risman's outburst. The other instructors wore mixed expressions. Gillette was clearly unamused, rolling her eyes and walking away without a word to stand on the outskirts of the pit. Rothgar looked troubled as he moved to follow her, but Elvir drew near Risman, placing a hand on his elbow and turning him away from the voices. "Watch out for that one," he remarked, glancing back at Valen. "He seems to have come predisposed to dislike those of our ancestry. Don't let him goad you, and don't let your emotions light your judgment." "Yes, sir," Risman said, taking in the wise words of his instructor. Elvir was a veteran of Melee Magther himself, and though his methods were now very different from those employed by the Academy, he'd still been a good teacher. Risman had learned much from him in their short time together.
"Aye, but remember also, this test's not about what you can do," Anders added. "I already know what you can do, and I've signed off on it, no matter what orders come through."
There was a bitterness in his tone that Risman found surprisingly comforting.
"This is about them. If you find the match too easy, draw it out. If you find them too challenging, which I doubt, Elvir would stand in for you."
"Yes, sir."
"Show them what yet remains to be proud of from your heritage," Elvir said, clapping Risman on the shoulder.
Then he and Anders went to join Gillette, with Valen and Korth trailing after. Risman turned to face the half-elf, who smiled pleasantly, her longsword in hand. "Well, this'll be fun," she said. "Are you gonna go easy on me? I am a delicate lady, after all." Her words came with a playful lilt, not mocking, as though this were all a game. Which, Risman supposed, it was. Just a sparring match to test skills. Nothing serious at all, no matter how wounded his pride was. It wasn't Jezra's fault he'd been kicked out of the commissioning, that he knew of, and she'd not treated him with the same disdain as Valen had. Risman took a breath to reorient himself, squaring up to face her, but he chose not to answer. He'd never understood why people felt the need to mix combat with words, even when he had nothing to prove. "All right, you two. First 3 points wins. Begin!" Risman dropped into his stance as Jezra lowered into hers. She reminded him of the cats that stalked around Elistrea's temple. They circled each other, Risman's eyes scanning for any telltale sign of an incoming attack. His empty hand was already twitching for a second blade, unused to adopting the single-bladed fighting style common to those who couldn't afford his fine tutelage. In truth, he almost wished he had been permitted to learn it instead, rather than be beaten for struggling to grasp Dreya Velv's two-handed method. He wasn't naturally ambidextrous. Learning to become so had been painfully slow, quite literally. But no prince of House Tyr was going to be seen fighting like a mere commoner. So he'd learned, and now fighting without the dirk seemed as unnatural as fighting with it had been in the beginning. Jezra tried to start a conversation twice more, but Risman remained silent, waiting for her to make the first move. She was the one being tested. It was up to her to decide how the match would go. When she seemed to understand that she would get no words out of Risman, Jezra finally pounced, lunging with a yell and a fierce swing of her two-handed sword. It was remarkably easy to dodge, though a good try. Again and again, Jezra swung, and each time, Risman stepped neatly out of her way. He parried once or twice, for the novelty of trying something different, but her heavier sword against his lighter blade sent unpleasant vibrations shooting through his forearm. She really wasn't all that bad. Someone had taught her well. Her stances were solid, her swings disciplined. She did have the unfortunate surface habit of shouting with every blow, but that would be easily trained out of her. Silence was far more valuable in the Underdark than the extra oomph the shouting supplied. When Jezra's amusement had melted into frustration, her face blazing and her breath labored, Risman glanced at Anders and received a nod. The next time Jezra struck, Risman slipped in between her defenses. He delivered 3 swift, light, and successive strikes to her shoulder, and then stepped back, raising his hands in surrender. Jezra groaned, her arms falling limp. "Really? You were toying with me that whole time?" Despite himself, Risman offered her an encouraging smile and broke his silence. "Not toying, testing. You fight well." "Oh, you do talk." She sheathed her blade and tossed her hair over her shoulder, pointing to him as she hailed Anders. "Whatever class he's in," she said between gulps of air, "I want to be in, too." That garnered a laugh from the instructors in Korth, but drained all of Risman's fragile good humor. He wasn't in a class anymore, and he wasn't on a patrol either. The feeling of having nowhere to belong was unsettling, and he was thankful when Anders called her back and sent Korth in her place. Belnir might have sent him off to be distracted, but it was a good distraction. He would just never admit it out loud. Korth was as uninterested in speaking as Risman was, which suited him just fine. He carried a claymore in one hand, the way Risman carried a short sword, which might have been intimidating if Risman had never fought something giant before. But after the Bone Flayer in Mendroktovan, size had become just another factor to consider. What Risman hadn't counted on was the quiet human speed or ferocity. The call to begin had barely left Anders' mouth before the giant charged. surprisingly swift, and swung. Risman's retreat was less than graceful, as he narrowly avoided the point of the claymore, and Korath didn't relent. His third frenzied slash caught Risman right on the chest, and he grunted as pain blossomed throughout his whole torso. It was accompanied by the telltale crack he'd gotten all too used to. "Point!" Anders hollered. Okay, yeah, that was mildly unpleasant. Risman gasped for breath, skipping back as he put a hand to his chest, willing himself to focus less on the pain and more on the brute charging straight for him. Unlike Jezra, Korath didn't show any inclination to formal training. He was big, he was fast, and that made him dangerous enough without being well trained, too. But now that Risman knew it, he knew how to counter it. Korath was fast, but so was Risman, and for once he was a smaller opponent. With his balance restored, it became a game of cat and mouse, until mercifully Anders gave the go-ahead to end the fight. When Korath next struck blindly, Risman went low, tripping the human with his sword and slashing twice at his back as he went down. Had the blade been sharpened, there would have been a nice neat X in Korath's shirt. "Match," Anders called, and Risman's breath came far more labored than it had before. Korath pushed himself up, spluttering as he wiped sand from his face. But when he found Risman, he grinned. "Good fight," he said, and offered his hand to clasp. Surprised by the friendly gesture, Risman accepted, though his whole body shook as the giant gripped his forearm. "I need a moment," Risman said, as he followed Korath to the wall. Anders granted it, and he leaned against the stone, regaining his breath. He'd left his water skin behind in the locker cavern, assuming he wouldn't be straying far for today's training. His chest ached, though whether his bones were bruised or broken, he couldn't yet decide. "Tired already?" Risman glanced up, narrowing his eyes as Valen edged near him. The others were distracted, with Gillette already showing her fellow half-elf some pointers, and Korath looking on with interest. The men were in discussion with Anders, so no one had noticed the golden elf detach. Tired? Of course he was tired. He'd just fought 2 duels back-to-back, leading his opponents around in circles for the sake of drawing out their potential, not to mention how every breath came sharp and stabbing after the blow he'd taken to his ribs. The matches hadn't been short, and now he was injured. It was a lot, even for him. He didn't say any of this, though. He just went back to his focused breathing, willing his heart rate to steady. "Didn't they work you 12 hours a day in Melee Mag there? That's what I've heard, at least. I thought your stamina would be better than this." Risman cut his eyes back to Valen, a sharp rebuke poised on his tongue. But he saw Elvir out of the corner of his eye and recalled his instructor's advice. Valen wasn't the first surface dweller to treat him with disdain. Depending on where they were in their healing process, many of the former captives of the Dark Elves gave him a wide berth or a hateful stare. Risman might not have done anything to them personally, but he bore the reputation of his people in his red eyes and white hair. It wasn't fair, but it was something to be patient with. Or so Solaran had said. With that in mind, Risman suddenly saw Valen in a different light. Just because he'd come from the surface didn't mean he hadn't been wounded in the past by drow. Hadn't Mizira been on the surface when the drow found her? Risman straightened, mastering his temper. "I don't know what's happened to you in the past," he said, "but I am sorry for it. It's our goal in the Sanctuary to ease suffering and reunite a people never meant to be parted. I hope you can find your peace here. I have." He actually meant it, too, which surprised him almost as much as it seemed to surprise Valen. The Golden Elf's smug satisfaction dropped, and he looked momentarily stunned. It would be a lie to say it wasn't at least a little satisfying, but Risman turned away before he could find too much joy in his victory. "I'm ready," he said, which wasn't completely true, but he wanted to avoid any more discussion with the elf. Anders nodded and motioned for him to take his place. Valen stalked after him, and Risman could practically feel his iron glare. When they faced each other, Valen's face was indeed contorted with fury. "You don't know anything," he hissed. True, but Risman was already in his battle stance, his ribs still protesting. The time for speaking was over. "Begin!" Risman expected Valen to charge recklessly, overcome with rage as he was. But instead, the Golden Elf relaxed, adopting a decent stance and raising his blade. Then, as though he hadn't a care in the world, he shut his eyes and breathed deeply. Risman just stared, unsure of what sort of trick this was. Who would willingly close their eyes in battle? He shuffled forward, testing Valen's alertness, and the elf tensed, though he didn't open his eyes. Risman danced back, then forward again, then feinted left and right. Each time, Valen shifted, keeping Risman in front of him. Walking silently on sand was an art Risman was still mastering, but he trod more carefully on his next feint, and was disappointed when Valen didn't react. He'd been interested to see how far this challenge would go. If nothing else, Valen was more patient than Risman. He'd waited out Jezra's circling, but he was already tired of waiting for Valen's first strike. So he lunged with true intent, and Valen's eyes popped open just in time to counter. The fight was on, and Risman's disappointment only increased. He'd expected more after Valen's blind stunt, but though the elf was trained, he wasn't good. He was mechanical, a construct. He'd memorized routines and patterns and didn't deviate from them in the slightest. Having learned similar routines, Risman barely had to try. After living for a year in a community that worshipped swordplay, which considered fencing its own form of art and dance, this fight was just boring. What a letdown. Risman didn't even wait for Anders' approval. He just ended the fight, with a slice to either side of his ribs and a chop to his shoulders. Valen didn't say a word. He just walked back to the others. Unsure of what was coming next, Risman followed. "All right, well done," Anders said. "Does anyone want the rematch with Risman now that you've had a chance to learn his style?" Only Jezra did, and to her credit, she fought better this time. She actually scored a point against him, with a clever feint he hadn't expected. After Valen's sleep-inducing duel, it was a welcome pick-me-up in pace. Once they finished and the others declined their opportunity for a rematch, something Risman was quite grateful for as he drank deeply from Elvir's waterskin, Anders gathered them together. "We've got one more match for ya," he said. "This time, it's 3-on-1. You three versus Risman. One strike and you're out. You think you're up for that, lad?" Anders added, glancing at Risman. Risman nodded, handing the waterskin back to Elvir. "Shouldn't be too hard," he said, before realizing how arrogant that sounded. He'd only meant he wasn't too tired for the challenge, not that he expected to win, though in truth, he did. He'd learned enough about their fighting styles and was well practiced in facing multiple opponents. "That's the spirit," Anders said. "All right then, when you're ready, get to it." The light from the city was steadily glinting from blue to white, now a powdery color. The time for the mid-cycle meal was drawing nearer, and Risman had places to be. Part 1 of his cycle might have been a total disaster, but that didn't mean he'd given up on his garden cavern walk with Mazira. He moved to the center of the pit, already analyzing his strategy. Of course, he knew what the purpose of this exam was. It was teamwork, the most crucial skill a warrior in the militia could possess. Where nobles and Menzoberranzan were taught Dreavelv and commoners studied Sar Leg, the sanctuary taught Balthazin, a style that favored superior numbers working together to destroy an enemy. It didn't matter how skilled each individual fighter was, if they couldn't work in a team, they'd be relegated to the beginner class until they learned how. The voices took up a triangular position around Risman, Korth at his back, Jezra and Valen in front. Unlike the duels, Risman wouldn't have to draw out this battle. It would draw itself out naturally. He was good, but he wasn't that good. It would take time to defeat all 3 opponents while avoiding taking any strikes himself. He'd go for Valen first, when the match began, and take back his favored short sword. But when Anders called for them to start, Valen suddenly vanished. One moment, he was there. The next, he'd disappeared, with nothing but the shift of sand to give evidence that he'd once stood there. Risman had no time to look for him, as Korath charged from behind. He leaped away, finding Jezra there to meet him with a clash of steel on steel. Korath was back again, but his wild swings were as much a hindrance to his sister as they were a threat to Risman. Not wanting to see anyone get hurt, Risman decided to take him out first. A swing and a slice later, and Korath was backing away, his hands raised in surrender. He was out of the game. Jezra was upon him once more, and they traded parries, while Risman's eyes darted around, searching for Valen. He found the golden elf standing aside, watching with interest, swinging his sword casually. The sight sparked fire under his skin. This was supposed to be a team match, and Valen wasn't playing as a team. Korath might not have been defeated so easily if he'd had more than Jezra to support him. Though it wasn't kind to the half-elf, Risman caught her sword with his own and then planted his boot in her gut, kicking her back. She gasped as the breath left her lungs, and it would have been the perfect opportunity to remove her from the game as well, if Risman wasn't after a different prize. Valen didn't deserve the sword he carried, blunted though it was. Risman was going to take it from him. The golden elf smirked as Risman came for him, and as if he knew what Risman wanted, he threw the sword at his feet, which made Risman draw up short. "You're going to want that," Valen said. There was no time to respond. Jezra had regained her breath and came for him again, and Risman didn't think. He reacted. Sweeping up the other sword, he spun and batted her attack away. It felt good to have 2 weapons again, even if he preferred the shorter dirk to 2 swords. He took the respite between attacks to switch his hands around, so that his favored blade was held in his favored right hand, before following Jezra's attack with a counter of his own. The sound of footsteps behind him made him duck, just as Valen's fist swung where his head once was. Really? A fist fight? Rolling to the side, Risman popped up to his feet and made for Jezra, his 2 hands spinning faster than her one sword could keep up with. A chop to her thigh sent her staggering back to her brother. Risman turned, expecting to find Valen right on his heels, but instead, the elf stood in the center of the arena, hands raised for battle. It was impossible for him to win now. He had no weapon, and this was a weapons test. Risman advanced on him slowly, so irritated he broke his no-talking rule. "If you wanted a rematch, you could have just asked. You let your team be defeated." "We would have lost anyway," Valen said. "These fights aren't really fair, are they? Forcing us to battle with weapons we don't prefer, against one who is trained explicitly for it." "It's not about fair," Risman countered. "It's about character, who you are and how you behave." "No," Valen said. "It's about skill." He lunged forward, moving so fast that Risman almost missed it, barely raising his arm in time to block Valen's open-handed strike. Where was his speed during their one-on-one duel? Risman staggered back, trying to keep up as Valen rained blow after blow with his palms. What he couldn't dodge, he blocked, surprised at the lack of force in Valen's strikes. Yet something wasn't right. Risman lost his breath far sooner than he should have been out of it. His arms were heavy, his strength weakening. Was he really that worn down from the previous fights? He didn't think he'd lost that much stamina since leaving Melee Mag there. The militia was kinder, but still intense. The longer this went on, the slower Risman became, until Valen seemed to move as a blur. He struck Risman's bicep with the open side of his hand, and all at once, Risman's whole arm lost feeling. His sword clattered to the sand. It felt like being stung with the numbing venom of a snake-headed whip. Panicked, Risman ordered his arm to move, to pick up his sword, but it just hung there, limp and useless. In his moment of distraction, Valen's hand came down on his other arm, and he lost feeling in that one too. Startled, he tried to back away, but his head was filling with fog and his feet weren't moving the way they ought. In an instant, Valen was before him again, his open palm landing squarely on his heart. Risman's entire chest seized as his ability to breathe ceased. He collapsed, choking on nothing, real fear erasing all his anger and confusion. What had this sun elf done to him? Distantly, he heard shouting. Valen stood over him, sword in hand, and looked rather pleased with himself. "I told you," he said. "I'm deadlier without a sword." He pressed the tip of the blade into Risman's chest, and all at once, his lungs began working again. His limbs tingled as though reawakening from sleep. Risman gasped and spluttered, rolling over and shoving the blade away from him. It was all he could do not to retch right there in the sand. "What in the 9 hells of the abyss do you think you're doing?" Anders hollered, marching over. "What did you do to him?" Valen raised his hands in surrender, painting innocence on his face. "Showcasing my skill, Master Anders," he said. "I'm trained in the art of Tuahata." "I don't care what sort of devilish sorcery you know. This was a weapons test." "It's not sorcery." It was Gillette who spoke. Her eyes narrowed as she regarded the Sun Elf. "Tuahata is an ancient and supposedly extinct martial art. Where did you say you were raised again?" Valen only smiled, clearly not intending to answer. "Well, I don't care what it is," Anders barked. "It was a dirty trick." Risman rose to his feet with Elvir and Hrothgar's help, tuning out the dwarf's tirade. His legs were shaking, but his head was clearing. Now that it was all over, he was more embarrassed than hurt. "Are you all right?" Elvir muttered. "Fine," Risman said shortly. "Give me a rematch and I'll be better." "You wouldn't be fooled twice." "Not this cycle, I think," Hrothgar said. He was glaring at Valen's back, obviously as displeased as the dwarf, though less vocal about it. "This might take a while," Elvir added. "Why don't you and I leave Anders to it? It's almost mid-light anyway, and I want to talk to you. I heard about the orders." Risman wanted to argue, his fingers twitching to redeem his pride. Or maybe they were just twitching after what Valen had done to him. He stared after the elf, debating whether or not to disobey Elvir's suggestion, before ultimately deciding not to. He allowed the older elf to guide him to the stairs, fuming more over his recent defeat than Elvir's reminder about the orders. And he'd thought this cycle couldn't get worse. Well, one thing was for certain. Tortured past or not, Risman did not care for the Golden Elf. Whatever class he ended up in, he'd hopefully be kept far away. Thank you for listening to this episode of Forsaken by Shadows, written and directed by me. Directed? That's not right. Written and produced by me, Sarah Danielle. And thank you again to Tabletop Audio and Pixabay for providing the music and ambiance used in this production. As always, Forsaken by Shadows is unofficial fan content not endorsed by Wizards of the Coast. If you're enjoying the story, please make sure to like, subscribe, and leave comments, and especially reviews on your podcast platforms. All of those things mean the world to me, and they go a long way in getting the story out for more people to enjoy. So if you have a moment, I would really appreciate it. Make sure you follow along to find out what happens next.